Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Teneo Insights Quick Take. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. The last week has seen U.S.-China trade tensions return with a vengeance, along with a dramatic demonstration last Friday of how on edge markets remain regarding the trajectory of the world's most consequential bilateral relationship. To consider the situation, how we got here, and what to look for going forward, I'm joined by two colleagues. Wendy Cutler is Vice President at the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former Acting Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. She's also a principal at Teneo's strategic partner, WestExec Advisors. And Gabe Wildau, known to many of you on this call as leads Teneo's coverage of China from here in the United States. So thank you both for joining me on short notice here today. Gabe, I thought I'd start with you for the benefit of our audience, just to sort of very quickly set the table. Where are we? What happened over the course of the last week? And maybe put that in the context of kind of quickly what transpired since Liberation Day and the subsequent attempts at ceasefire negotiations between the U.S. and China, and how we got where we are.
Sure. Well, I mean, in some ways, this story begins many years ago with the first big deployment of U.S. export controls against China during the first Trump administration, and then the escalation of those controls under Biden. But I think we can start for our purposes with Liberation Day. And Trump imposed major tariffs on China on Liberation Day. And China retaliated not only with tariffs of its own, but also with new export controls on rare earths that within just a few weeks were threatening to shut down production at U.S. auto factories and in other industries, and including defense production. But after that, things stabilized between the U.S. and China. There were some hiccups. They met in Geneva in May, and they seemed to reach an agreement that would cause the flow of rare earths and magnets to the U.S. to resume. But when China didn't unlock those export approvals quickly enough, the U.S. side imposed some very powerful kind of ad hoc export controls of their own on chip design software, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and some other key inputs. And that put the relationship on the verge of collapse again. But the two sides managed to avoid collapse. So we had this presidential phone call in June, and that was followed by another round of high-level talks in London, and that restored this tariff truce and the kind of export control truce. And ever since then, the bilateral relationship seemed to be at least stable and really on a positive trajectory. We had a couple of additional rounds of bilateral talks in Stockholm and then in Madrid, and there were some goodwill gestures from both sides. And we were looking ahead to this anticipated presidential meeting in South Korea at the end of this month. And that meeting was expected in turn to lay groundwork for a final kind of negotiating push towards a bilateral trade deal that President Trump could sign when he visits, as he's expected to do, or as he said he intends to do, visiting China sometime early in 2026. So that's where things stood by the end of September. But since then, both sides have imposed new coercive measures that have triggered this latest round of escalation and cast some doubt on whether that we're still on track for that bilateral deal. So there's been a flurry of activities over the last few weeks, but I think the key ones to focus on here are, first, the U.S. Commerce Department's big expansion of its export control blacklist, the so-called entity list, and that was on September 29th. And it seems that U.S. officials regarded that move as a kind of technical adjustment aimed at closing loopholes in the entity list mechanism. The Chinese saw that move as highly escalatory because it effectively added around 10,000 Chinese companies to that blacklist, even though those companies were affiliated already with companies that were already on the list. So then on October 9th, China comes out with this really sweeping new package of export controls, which not only expands the rare earth controls, but also adds controls on other industrial inputs like lithium battery components and the so-called super hard materials that are used in precision manufacturing. And that set of controls, if fully enforced, could be hugely impactful. And in theory, it gives China effectively a kind of a veto power over a huge swath of global trade, because the rules impose a license requirement on exports from any country, not just exports from China, but from any country, if the product contains Chinese rare earths or was manufactured using Chinese rare earths. And so this long-arm jurisdiction is a model after the U.S.'s so-called foreign direct product rule, which also asserts similar extraterritorial jurisdiction. So this second set of export controls from October came as a major shock to U.S. officials. They viewed it as highly escalatory. And so President Trump has threatened to cancel the upcoming meeting with Xi in South Korea, although he's since kind of backed off that threat. But he's also threatening another 100% tariff effective November 1st on China. And perhaps more importantly, he's threatening to reimpose some of these ad hoc export controls that he had imposed back in May, when the initial Geneva truce seemed to break down: the semiconductor tools, jet engines, chip design software, and other products. So that's kind of where things stand now, with China having pushed out this huge sweeping package. The U.S. considering its retaliation. I expect to see that in the next few days. And now we're looking ahead to what can still be achieved at this meeting in South Korea. And are we still on track for an actual trade deal next year?
And as you said, over the weekend and during the Sunday shows, the president and vice president both sort of tried to suggest that there was room to get that meeting back on track, and to put some off ramps on the current escalation cycle. The Ministry of Commerce in China likewise kind of walked back a little bit from the sort of the maximalist interpretation of the rare earths. But Wendy, kind of bringing you in here, Gabe made this point that, after the summer, we were sort of, it seemed like we were on a relatively, all things considered, relatively smooth glide to the Xi-Trump meeting in South Korea at the end of this month. And irrespective of whether whether the U.S. intended the expansion of the entity list to the affiliates to be kind of a technical adjustment or escalatory, why did, in your view, is all of this happening right now? Or are both sides kind of misreading the signals here of the other?
Well, I think this just underscores how fragile this détente is. And as you mentioned, there's just a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lack of trust, and we're seeing a much more assertive China. And China now feels like it has the upper hand. It feels like Trump wants and needs this meeting more than China. And it feels that it can, threaten or impose these new restrictions without little pushback from the United States. But I think in many respects, as we've seen over the past 72 hours, China's overplayed its hand here. And these new critical mineral regulations that also apply to batteries and chemicals and some other products, if implemented the way described, this would be an enormous restriction, not only on the United States, but on all other countries of the world that are using even the smallest amount of rare earths from China.
So is it fair to say, in your estimation then, that when the U.S. took the action that they did on the entity list, that they may have expected some sort of response out of China, but that this response was way out of proportion with what they thought that they might elicit out of China? So is it fair to say they were deeply surprised, as Gabe suggests, that this was the response?
Absolutely. And Jameson Greer was on TV within 24 hours saying they were surprised and shocked, and that this was an escalatory move by China.
And what do you think, as we sit here now, anticipating trying to get an off ramp and head toward that meeting, and it feels like both sides would probably benefit from a principals meeting at the highest level, but what it seems as though the key policymakers and the spokesman in this round has primarily been the Secretary of the Treasury. It seems to me more than the trade representative. As an example, But there's been this kind of carrot and stick set of proposals or suggestions out there. How would you characterize the U.S. arsenal on this front right now, or is this rare earths issue going to be this kind of sword of Damocles that China can continue to wield with near impunity because of their command of that critical industry?
So look, right now, both sides, I think, are clearly looking for an off-ramp. Besson has already said that he has been in contact with his counterparts. There's a delegation from China apparently in town with the IMF World Bank meetings next week. There'll be more discussions. And so my gut tells me there will be a meeting and maybe some off-ramp will be found. But I think you're absolutely right that this critical minerals kind of is going to be overhang the relationship. But let's also remember the U.S. has a lot of chokeholds as well on China, including on software. And that's another threat that Trump issued along with the tariff increase. And that was to impose or ban software exports to China. In terms of the off-ramp, just based on my experience, I think they're kind of two routes that they can go. And one would just be to delay everything and for the two leaders to meet and either announce that they've agreed to put off all of these measures for the next 90 days and have Bessent and the vice premier sort through this stuff and try and find some kind of agreement. The other would be to kind of work with these restrictions on the table on critical minerals and try to limit their application or limit their scope so that their impact will presumably be minimal and won't impact the United States.
So, Gabe, talk about it a little bit from the Chinese side here and their assessment or misassessment of what the U.S. was doing. Why did they go so extreme with this, knowing that it would probably elicit the market reaction it did? But why use that weapon right now? Do you think that there's a sort of a are they misreading the room here a little bit themselves? Are there debates between differing agencies with power here in China on what to do? What's your read on their perspective and what's motivating and or restricting their behavior right now?
Well, one of the big debates that's been raging over the last week or so among China analysts is, this export control package that we saw on October 9th, was that a tactical response to the recent flurry of measures from both sides, or is it a tactical effort to build leverage ahead of the Trump-Xi meeting, or is this a strategic move to assert this massive degree of control over global trade? And I guess my view is it's a bit of both. Certainly, these controls would have had to have been at the ready, formulated, drafted before the entity list move. It's just too complicated and too sprawling to work up over a few days. But the timing probably is affected by what the U.S. did, but we might still think, well, this was going to come sooner or later. It just came sooner because of the kind of tactical back and forth. And I think, we can draw back the lens a little bit. I started our story with April 2nd, Liberation Day, but from China's perspective, they've been subject to these kinds of coercive export controls now for 8 years, starting with the Huawei entity listing in, 2018. And since then, the October 2022 package under the Biden administration, the subsequent upgrades and revisions to those packages in the subsequent Octobers. And so this is a response, I think, China's export controls of October 9th are a response not only to the entity list action of late September, but to this whole series, this, almost decade-long series of export controls. And they want to show that they can't be pushed around. And I mean, to Wendy's point about, where do we go from here? And could this be rolled back? Or could it be entirely rescinded, what China has done? Or will they find a way to work within it? And my view is that China is, having pulled the trigger on this, very unlikely to just cancel the whole mechanism. Because remember, it's not just about the U.S. It's not specifically targeting the U.S. It applies to the whole world. But where there is room for negotiation is how it's enforced. And the Chinese Commerce Ministry has already talked about, temporary licenses, general licenses. So there are ways without rescinding the regulation, but to kind of basically effectively remove it by granting like a broad license that will keep the rare earths and these other materials flowing until and unless the relationship takes another downward turn in which, at a moment's notice, they can then reimpose it. So I think the basic policy infrastructure here from China is here to stay, but there's a lot of latitude on the outcomes, the range of scenarios ranges from almost no effect. If the political relationship is good and China wants to play nice, this could mean almost nothing. But if China doesn't want to play nice, not only with the U.S., with other countries, it could be absolutely, hugely impactful. So yeah, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think China doesn't intend to give up on this leverage. It's just how hard they want to push the button at any moment.
So just to wrap up here, it sounds like both of you think that as complicated as the situation has become, there are incentives for both sides to try to lower the temperature and make it to the meeting in South Korea, and then go from there. Wendy, let me give you the last word here, though. Beyond the Xi and Trump meeting and the other variables, that you are watching, it seems to me that following the history that Gabe has laid out at the beginning of our call, that there were some who have, after seeing a flurry of bilateral deals between the U.S. and many of its trading partners, and this kind of, détente, notwithstanding this flare-up that is all too, we're all too susceptible to, as you suggested, but that a lot of economic players out there, companies, market participants, and the like, were starting to think, okay, now we essentially know what the contours of the trading regime are going to look like worldwide. Let's start moving forward. And yet there are a lot of variables out there, the details on a lot of these deals, other countries accelerating trade negotiations that exclude the United States, the Supreme Court ruling on the APEC, the emergency-oriented tariffs, Section 232 and 301 investigations that are ongoing. Like, what are you kind of worried about or seeing out there? Have I got everything that's in the mix right now there, or what's
I could add
people thinking about?
I could add the port fees that both China and the U.S. put into effect just yesterday. The president's also now threatening tariffs on cooking oil from China. So I think the message here is that even though we're all exhausted and we would love to kind of put this chapter of tariff hikes and trade tension behind us, that this is here to stay. And with China, I think we need to expect escalation in the future, de-escalation, further escalation. But I think the relationship is going to be focused on dealing with flashpoints in the relationship and not really looking for ways to address other long-term or structural irritants. And with respect to other countries as well, I question how durable some of these deals that have been reached will be, particularly if countries that have reached deals are hit with a lot of sectoral tariffs, or the IEEPA tariffs are struck down by the Supreme Court. I think that the administration has a plan B. So I counsel everyone, whether we like it or not, we're living in a tariff world, and we're living in a world where trade friction is going to be paramount. And we may see ebbs and flows, but they're going to be ups and downs. And folks need to be prepared and ready and come up with contingencies.
So the bottom line is you and Gabe are not allowed to take any holiday time. That way, Teneo and WestExec alike will be here to continue to advise our friends and clients. So if you have any questions for either of our guests today, please don't hesitate to email us at teneoinsights@teneo.com. I'd like to thank Wendy Cutler and Gabe Wildau for joining me today. Until next time, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.